Medellin was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels like it is holding its breath. The city's lights twinkled like scattered stars across the hills, casting a soft glow that made the mountains look alive. Down in the valley, street dogs barked in the distance, and a faint hum of motorcycles echoed on empty roads. Somewhere, behind the walls of a modest house, a young boy was lying awake, his eyes open, staring into the darkness. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and though he was only a child then, he would one day become the most feared and most celebrated man in all of Colombia. It was as if the city itself already knew what was coming, a storm that would rise from its very heart and change the country forever. People would call him many things in the years to come: El Patron, the king of cocaine, the Robin Hood of Medellin. To some, he was a hero who gave the poor what the government never did: homes, food, jobs. To others, he was a ruthless murderer who drenched the streets in blood and declared war on an entire nation. His story is a contradiction, a paradox wrapped in billions of dollars, car bombs, soccer matches, and whispered prayers. Tonight, as we follow his life from its humble beginnings to its violent end, we will explore not just the man but the myth, the dream that turned into a nightmare. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Medellin of the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was a growing city, a place where farmers came to sell their produce, where children played barefoot in dusty streets, where vendors shouted in the plazas. It smelled of coffee, of smoke from wood-burning stoves, of rain falling on worn pavement. It was a city full of hope but also of hardship. Pablo's family was not wealthy, his father was a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. They worked hard, but money was always short. For a young boy like Pablo, this was a world full of limits, full of invisible fences keeping him from the life he wanted. And he wanted more, much more than anyone around him could imagine. From an early age, Pablo was restless, clever, and bold. He hated the idea of being ordinary. He wanted to be remembered. Some say he once told friends that he would be president of Colombia one day, and if not president, then the richest man the country had ever seen. It was not just talk. He had a certain spark, the kind of presence that made people follow him, even as a boy. The streets were his classroom, the markets his training ground. He watched how people bargained, how money changed hands, how power seemed to belong to those who dared to take it. There is a calmness to this story tonight, but do not be fooled, what is to come will test even the bravest hearts. Pablo's journey would be paved with ambition and violence, with loyalty and betrayal. There would be moments of quiet generosity, where he built homes for the poor, and moments of chilling terror, where explosions tore through crowded streets. The tale of Pablo Escobar is not just about crime, it is about dreams taken to their extreme. It is about what happens when a man decides that nothing, not even the law, can stop him from becoming what he believes he was meant to be. Imagine sitting in the dim glow of a Medellin bar in the 1970s long before the world knew his name. You might have seen a young Pablo leaning back in his chair, smiling with quiet confidence, his mind already plotting the empire he would soon build. He was patient, careful, waiting for the right opportunity. And when cocaine began its surge into the United States, when demand exploded and profits soared, Pablo Escobar stepped forward to seize his moment. It was the perfect storm, a poor country with a new lucrative export, corrupt officials willing to look the other way, and a man ambitious enough to run it all. But for now, we are still at the beginning. The hills of Medellin remain peaceful tonight. The cicadas sing softly, the city sleeps, and the boy who will one day bring the world to its knees dreams quietly under the same sky. There is an almost innocent stillness in this moment, as if the world has not yet noticed him. And perhaps that is what makes this story so haunting, the knowledge that somewhere out there, the next Pablo Escobar is lying awake right now, dreaming of power, dreaming of escape, dreaming of a world that will one day speak his name. This is where our story begins, in a city that was both cradle and crucible, in the mind of a boy who would refuse to be ordinary. What happens next will take us into jungles where cocaine labs hide beneath the trees, into mansions where millions are stacked like bricks, and into a nation's darkest days where car bombs shake the earth and fear spreads like smoke. But for now, let us stay in the calm of this night, with Medellin's lights flickering like stars, and the quiet knowledge that a legend is about to rise. The first light of dawn crept gently over the mountains, painting the hills of Antioquia in a soft golden glow. Medellin was still quiet, its streets almost empty except for the sound of distant roosters calling in the countryside. In a modest home, a boy stirred, rising to another day that would look, at least on the surface, like every day before it. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and though the world would one day fear him, this morning he was just a barefoot child, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher, waking up to the scent of fresh arepas and the damp smell of earth. Life in rural Colombia in the 1950s was hard but simple. Pablo's father, Abel de Jesus, worked the land, cultivating crops under the blazing sun. His mother, Hermilda, was the heart of the household, a woman known for her strength, discipline, and fierce determination to give her children an education. She believed education was the key to a better life, and she expected her children to take their studies seriously. But Pablo was restless. Even as a child, he was not content to wait for life to hand him anything. There was an energy in him, a curiosity that pushed him beyond the lessons in the classroom. Medellin in those years was a city in transition. It was no longer just a sleepy town in the mountains, it was becoming an industrial hub, a place of opportunity for those willing to take risks. Factories were springing up, and the city's population was growing fast. But opportunity did not reach everyone equally. Many families, like Pablo's, struggled to make ends meet. The contrast was sharp. In one neighborhood you might see grand colonial houses with gardens and tall gates, while just a few blocks away children ran through dusty alleys, their feet caked with mud, their bellies often empty. For a young boy with sharp eyes and an even sharper ambition, this contrast was impossible to ignore. From a young age, Pablo displayed a knack for getting what he wanted. Local stories tell of him selling stolen gravestones to smugglers who would sand off the names and resell them. Others claim he once told classmates that he would be a millionaire by the time he turned 22. Whether every detail of these childhood tales is true or not, one thing is certain: Pablo was not like the other boys. He was already thinking about the future, already planning. Imagine him walking through the bustling markets of Medellin, the noise of vendors hawking their goods filling the air, the smell of fruit, coffee, and tobacco mingling with the dust. He would watch the men who drove the nicest cars, the ones who seemed untouchable, and he would wonder what it would take to become one of them. Poverty was a weight he did not want to carry for the rest of his life. He saw education not as a path to respectability, as his mother hoped, but as too slow, too limited. He wanted something faster, something bigger. The city was alive with whispers of opportunity: smuggling cigarettes, selling contraband, moving stolen cars. For many, these were petty crimes born out of necessity, but for Pablo, they were stepping stones. Each risk he took, each hustle he tried, gave him a taste of power and independence. The boy who once sat in his mother's classroom dreaming of more was now beginning to understand how to bend the world to his will. And yet, there was another side to him, the boy who loved soccer, who laughed with friends, who adored his mother. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned purple, Pablo would sit outside, listening to the music from neighbors' radios, the soft strum of guitars, the voices singing of love, loss, and hope. It was a city of contrasts, and Pablo was a boy of contrasts, gentle one moment, defiant the next. As we follow this part of his life, there is a calm inevitability to where it is leading. The Medellín of Pablo's childhood was a place where the rules could be bent, where bribes could open doors, where clever boys could turn small hustles into serious money. The seeds of the future cartel boss were being planted, watered by a mixture of poverty, ambition, and a city that rewarded boldness. One can imagine Hermilda watching her son with both pride and concern. She wanted him to become someone respectable, someone who could lift the family out of hardship. She taught him discipline, but discipline could only hold him for so long. The world outside their home was calling, louder with each passing year. It was not just money Pablo craved. It was respect, it was power, it was freedom from the invisible chains that kept poor families poor. He wanted to write his own destiny, to live without asking permission from anyone. That desire would guide every decision he made from here onward. It would make him loved, feared, and eventually hunted. By the time he was a teenager, Pablo was already forming small gangs with friends, already testing his boundaries. They would steal cars, strip them for parts, sell what they could. He was learning the mechanics of crime, but also the mechanics of leadership. People followed him because he was bold, because he seemed to know what to do next, because he could make them feel safe even while breaking the law. Tonight, as you listen, picture that boy on the streets of Medellín, the dust rising around his feet as he walks with a confidence far beyond his years. He does not yet know just how far this path will take him, how many lives will be touched by the choices he will make. But already, there is no turning back. The line between right and wrong has begun to blur, and Pablo is stepping toward the side that promises everything he has ever wanted at a price that will one day prove far greater than he can imagine. The streets of Medellín were Pablo's first classroom, and by the time he entered his late teens, he had learned lessons that no school could teach. He had learned that fear could be power if you used it correctly, that loyalty could be bought if you paid it well, and that opportunities often came disguised as risks. The small boy who once sold trinkets and contraband was no longer satisfied with pocket change. Now, he wanted real money, the kind that could change his family's life and announce to the world that Pablo Escobar was someone to be reckoned with. He began with stolen cars. At first, it was a simple game: take a car, strip it, sell the parts. But Pablo quickly realized there was more money in returning the car to its owner for a fee. It was a crude form of ransom, but it worked. People paid because they were desperate, and Pablo always delivered. He developed a reputation as someone who could find your missing car for the right price. It was a dangerous hustle, but it made him known on the streets, and that was what he wanted. He was no longer just another poor kid, he was someone who could get things done. Imagine him at night, crouched in the shadows, watching as a target car was parked on a quiet street. The crickets sang, the city's hum softened, and Pablo's crew moved quickly, silently. In minutes, the car was gone, vanished into the night. This was not just theft, this was the first taste of command, of running a crew, of being the one who gave the orders. He loved the rush, the way the world seemed to bend to his will, even if just for a few moments. But cars were just the beginning. Medellín was a city buzzing with smuggling operations. Appliances, cigarettes, liquor, anything that could bypass taxes and make a profit moved through secret routes into the city. Pablo began working with established smugglers, learning the business, understanding how to bribe the right officials, how to hide goods, how to transport contraband without being caught. It was a dangerous education, but it was also the perfect apprenticeship for the empire he would one day run. He was clever, patient, and always thinking ahead. If one route was blocked, he found another. If one official asked for too much money, he replaced him with another who was cheaper or more desperate. Every deal he made, every risk he took, was a step up the ladder. And slowly, he began to build a network, friends, allies, partners, who would help him move from petty hustler to organized criminal. There is a calm suspense in imagining these nights, the trucks rumbling down narrow mountain roads, their headlights cutting through the mist. Inside, hidden beneath sacks of grain or crates of fruit, were the cigarettes or liquor that would sell for a fortune in the city. Pablo would wait for them, counting the hours, knowing that each successful delivery meant more money, more power. It was during this time that Pablo began to understand the value of reputation. Fear was a currency, and Pablo was learning how to spend it wisely. If someone cheated him, he made an example of them. If someone betrayed him, he made sure the entire neighborhood knew what would happen to anyone who tried it again. But he was not cruel without purpose. Violence, for Pablo, was never random, it was calculated, a tool to protect his growing business. He also discovered something else, he had charisma. People liked him, or at least respected him. He could talk his way out of trouble, charm police officers, make partners feel like they were part of something bigger. It was this charisma, combined with his ruthlessness, that made him stand out. There were many young men stealing cars and running contraband, but few had Pablo's vision. Some stories say he would sit with friends late into the night, talking about how one day they would all be rich, how they would live in mansions and drive the best cars. They would laugh, drink cheap beer, and dream. But deep down, Pablo meant every word. He believed in those dreams so strongly that others began to believe too. By the early 1970s, Pablo had made enough money to move beyond car theft and small-scale smuggling. He began dealing in larger contraband shipments, televisions, household goods, even stolen cattle. Each step brought more money, and with money came more problems. Competitors appeared, men who wanted to take what Pablo had built. But Pablo was ready for them. He was willing to fight, and if fighting was not enough, he was willing to kill. Imagine the growing tension on the streets, the whispered warnings, the sudden disappearances. Medellín was a place where power was fragile, where one wrong move could mean the end. But Pablo thrived in this world. The more dangerous it became, the stronger he seemed to grow. His friends noticed the change. He was still the same smiling, joking Pablo, but there was steel in his eyes now, a hardness that had not been there before. It is important to remember that Pablo's rise was not built on luck alone. It was built on relentless ambition, on sleepless nights, on risks that would have scared others away. He was laying the foundation for something much bigger, though even he might not have known just how big it would become. And then came the discovery that would change everything: cocaine. At first, it was just another product, another way to make money. But Pablo saw what others did not. He saw that cocaine was not just a drug but a business that could grow beyond Colombia's borders, a business that could make him richer than anyone he had ever known. But that is where we must pause for now, at the edge of a new world, with Pablo standing at the threshold. He has mastered the art of smuggling, he has built his reputation, he has learned how to command respect and fear. Ahead of him lies the path to power, paved with white powder, glistening under the moonlight. The next step will be bigger than anything he has ever attempted, and the world will soon know his name. The 1970s were a time of change for Colombia, and for Pablo Escobar, they were the years when his ambitions finally found their perfect fuel. The contraband business had taught him how to move goods, how to bribe officials, and how to stay invisible when it mattered most. But all of that was just preparation. The real opportunity, the one that would make him a legend, was waiting in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia, where coca leaves were harvested and processed into a fine white powder that was just beginning to take the world by storm: cocaine. At first, cocaine was a novelty. It was a party drug for the wealthy in Miami and New York, a glamorous secret that spread quietly through nightclubs and penthouses. But soon, demand began to rise, not just rise, but explode. Americans wanted more of it than anyone could supply, and every gram that crossed the border could sell for a small fortune. Pablo saw what others could not. This was not just a product, it was a gold rush. And like every gold rush, the fortune would go to the ones bold enough to control the supply. Medellín became the perfect launchpad. The city was already a hub for smuggling, its roads leading out into the mountains where clandestine airstrips could be carved from the jungle. Pablo, with his network of contacts and his taste for risk, was perfectly positioned to step in. He began to fund small laboratories where coca paste was turned into pure cocaine. The smell of gasoline, ether, and chemicals would hang heavy in the air as men worked day and night, stirring wats, drying powder, packing bricks. Picture those jungle labs under a shroud of mist. Wooden tables stacked with trays of drying cocaine, workers wearing handkerchiefs over their faces, the hum of generators in the background. At night, the forest would come alive with the chirp of insects, and somewhere in the distance, a small plane would roar to life, ready to take off under cover of darkness. These were Pablo's first steps into the empire he would one day command, but already the profits were staggering. For Pablo, this was more than business, this was destiny. He had always said he would be a millionaire by 22, and now he was well on his way. The money poured in faster than he could count it. His network grew. He hired pilots, chemists, drivers, and guards. The young car thief was now becoming a businessman, but a businessman with guns, with muscle, with an iron will to win. But the cocaine trade was not without danger. The authorities were beginning to take notice. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was stepping up its presence in Colombia, and the Colombian police were under pressure to crack down on the new wave of smuggling. But Pablo was ready. He had learned how to use bribes like tools, money for the police who would look the other way, gifts for the officials who might otherwise interfere. If bribery failed, intimidation followed. One of Pablo's most famous phrases was born during this era: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. It was this philosophy that kept his growing operation running smoothly. Those who cooperated got rich. Those who resisted disappeared. Slowly but surely, Pablo became a name that carried both respect and fear. Medellin's underworld began to orbit around him. And yet, there was a strange calmness to his rise. He was methodical, careful. He kept a low profile, driving ordinary cars, dressing simply, living in a way that did not yet reveal the billions that were to come. To the poor of Medellin, he was still one of them, a local boy who had made good. To the authorities, he was just another smuggler, not yet the national threat he would soon become. The planes were the heart of the operation. Small aircraft loaded with cocaine would take off from hidden airstrips, fly low over the jungle to avoid radar, and land in remote areas of the Caribbean or directly in Florida. Sometimes, the planes would drop their cargo at sea, where boats would scoop it up. It was a risky business, but the profits were so high that even losing a plane now and then barely made a dent. Pablo also began to establish a reputation as a man who took care of his people. Workers in the labs were paid well. Pilots were rewarded handsomely for dangerous missions. Guards and gunmen were loyal because they knew Pablo looked after their families if something happened to them. This loyalty would become one of his most powerful weapons in the years to come. Imagine the money flowing back into Medellin. Suitcases of cash arriving every week, hidden in trucks, counted late into the night in dimly lit rooms where the only sound was the steady hum of counting machines and the rustle of bills. Pablo's organization grew so fast that soon there were more bills than banks could handle. But instead of slowing down, Pablo pushed harder. He saw no limits, no reason to stop. Every successful shipment brought him closer to the power he craved. He began to think bigger, more planes, bigger labs, new routes. The business was no longer just his, it was becoming a cartel, an organization that could outmaneuver governments and outgun police forces. The Medellín Cartel had not yet been formally named, but its foundations were already being laid. And with this rise came something darker. Violence began to creep in more frequently. Competitors were eliminated, rivals were warned, and anyone who stood in Pablo's way was dealt with swiftly. The young man who once dreamed of wealth was now beginning to understand the price of power. The stakes were higher than ever, and so were the risks. But for now, the empire was still rising, the money still flowing, and the world had not yet seen the full storm that was coming. Pablo Escobar was still just a man building a business, but soon, he would be a man building a war. The quiet hum of the jungle labs would one day be drowned out by the sound of explosions, but tonight, the planes still take off under the stars, carrying with them the powder that will make Pablo one of the richest men alive. The foundation had been laid. Pablo Escobar was no longer just a smuggler moving cocaine across borders, he was a man on the verge of creating something far bigger, something that would soon be called by a name whispered with both fear and awe, the Medellín Cartel. What had begun with jungle labs and small airstrips was about to become an empire so vast it would touch every level of Colombian society and shake governments across the world. But Pablo could not do it alone. Even a man as driven as he was needed partners, trusted allies, who could manage the different pieces of this growing operation. And so, slowly, he began to gather around him a circle of men who would form the backbone of the Medellín Cartel. Each one brought something unique to the table, and together they became a network of power that was more organized, more disciplined, and more profitable than anything Colombia had ever seen. One of the first was George Luis Oco and his brothers, Fabio and Juan David. The Ocos came from a respected ranching family and had access to resources, land, and social connections that were invaluable. They provided not only financial backing but also legitimacy in certain circles. They were businessmen, shrewd and calculating, and they saw in Pablo the charisma and daring that could take them all to heights they had never imagined. Then there was Carlos Lehder, the flamboyant and ambitious smuggler whose dream was to turn cocaine smuggling into a streamlined, professional operation. Lehder's genius was logistics. He envisioned building a network of air routes and drop points that would make transportation efficient and nearly unstoppable. He would eventually secure an entire private island in the Bahamas, Norman's Cay, turning it into a hub where planes could refuel, reload, and continue their journey to the United States. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, was another crucial figure. He was ruthless, a man who preferred action to words, and he brought with him not just money but also a private army. Rodriguez Gacha would become one of the most feared men in Colombia, handling much of the cartel's enforcement and security operations. Together with Pablo, these men formed a partnership that was as dangerous as it was profitable. Imagine them sitting together in a hidden finca high in the hills, the table covered in maps, routes, and ledgers. The air thick with cigarette smoke, the conversation low but intense. They were not just criminals anymore, they were building a corporation. There were divisions of labor, responsibilities, rules. Every partner had their role, every shipment was planned with military precision. And the money. The money was like a river that could not be stopped. With each passing month, the shipments grew larger. Tons of cocaine were leaving Colombia, heading north. The United States became flooded with product, and the profits came pouring back. Pablo and his partners had to buy warehouse just to store the cash, and even then, they ran out of space. Rubber bands to bundle the money cost thousands of dollars each month. Some of the cash was buried in fields, hidden in walls, even eaten by rats. There was simply too much of it to keep track of. Yet despite the staggering wealth, Pablo remained focused. He knew that with great profit came great risk, and so he worked to make the organization as disciplined as possible. Bribery was systematized, politicians, police, and customs officers were paid on time like employees. Those who refused to take bribes were threatened, and if threats failed, they were eliminated. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, became the guiding principle of the cartel. The cartel was more than a criminal group, it was a shadow government. It provided jobs, security, and money for those who cooperated, and swift punishment for those who did not. In many ways, Pablo began to see himself not just as a businessman but as a leader of the people. He would visit poor neighborhoods, building soccer fields, handing out cash, paying for medicine and schools. The people loved him for it. To them, he was not a criminal but a benefactor, a man who had risen from the same dusty streets and who had not forgotten them. Picture the hillsides of Medellín lit up with lights at night, entire neighborhoods built with money from Pablo Escobar. Children playing on fields he had funded, mothers praying for his protection. His name became legend, spoken with admiration in the barrios even as it struck fear in the halls of government. But inside the cartel, there was always tension. The partnership was strong, but the stakes were enormous. Everyone knew that one mistake, one betrayal, could mean death. Rival smuggling groups were watching, waiting for a chance to take a piece of the action. And across the ocean, the Americans were beginning to realize just how big this new cocaine pipeline was becoming. The DEA was expanding its efforts, and Pablo and his partners knew that the war was coming, if not now, then soon. Still, there was a strange calm before the storm. These were the glory days of the cartel, when everything seemed possible. The partners were united, the money endless, the future wide open. Pablo would sit late into the night, counting money, planning the next shipment, dreaming of something even bigger, not just wealth, but power, real power, the kind that could not be taken away. And so, the Medellín Cartel was born not in chaos, but in order, carefully structured, ruthlessly efficient, almost corporate in its precision. It was a machine that turned coca leaves into gold, and it would soon make Pablo Escobar one of the richest men on earth. But every empire has its peak, and every peak is followed by a fall. For now, though, the rise continued, unstoppable, like a river in flood. The partners toasted their success, the planes kept flying, and the world had not yet seen the violence that was waiting just beyond the horizon. The story of Pablo Escobar had now moved beyond Medellín's streets and jungles. It had become international, global, unstoppable. And as the empire expanded, so too did Pablo's vision. He no longer wanted to be just the richest man in Colombia, he wanted to be untouchable, unchallenged, a man who could shape the future of an entire nation. That dream would lead him to heights no criminal had ever reached, and to a war that would burn through Colombia like fire. The money was no longer coming in waves, it was coming in floods, washing over Medellín and turning Pablo Escobar into one of the richest men alive. By the early 1980s, his empire was moving an estimated 80 tons of cocaine into the United States every month. The profits were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars a week, billions every year. It was wealth on a scale so massive that even Pablo struggled to keep track of it all. Picture a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of Medellín. Inside, stacks of US dollars rose higher than a man's head, wrapped in rubber bands, lined up in neat rows like bricks waiting to build a house. The air smelled of ink and paper, and the sound of counting machines filled the night. But even counting became impossible after a while. There was simply too much. Pablo and his accountants began measuring money by weight instead of by number. If a stack weighed a certain amount, they knew roughly how many millions were inside. Despite their efforts, the money could not all be stored neatly. It had to be hidden, stashed away, buried. Pablo ordered his men to dig holes in farms and fields, filling them with barrels of cash. Some of it was walled up inside buildings, concealed behind false panels. Some of it was simply lost, eaten by rats, destroyed by moisture. It is said that Pablo wrote off millions of dollars each month as spoilage, as casually as a grocery store might discard spoiled fruit. But even with the losses, there was still more money than he could ever spend. And Pablo spent lavishly. He bought vast estates, including his most famous property, Hacienda Nápoles, a sprawling ranch about 100 miles east of Medellín. It was not just a home, it was a kingdom. Imagine driving through its massive gates, passing a private runway, swimming pools, tennis courts, and artificial lakes. On the front lawn stood a life-sized replica of a small plane, a monument to the first aircraft Pablo ever used to smuggle cocaine into the United States. The estate was filled with wonders, a private zoo with elephants, giraffes, hippos, exotic birds. Children could ride go-karts through the property or visit a collection of classic cars and motorcycles. There was even a private bullring. Hacienda Napoles became a symbol of Pablo's wealth and power, a place where friends, politicians, and business associates were entertained in grand style. It was a playground, but also a fortress, guarded by men with rifles who patrolled the perimeter day and night. Pablo's lifestyle grew more extravagant with each passing year. He traveled in convoys of armored vehicles, kept safe houses scattered across the country, and owned fleets of planes and helicopters. He collected art, jewelry, and properties around the world. His spending was so excessive that at times it seemed almost surreal. And yet, he never lost the ability to charm. He still visited poor neighborhoods, handing out cash and food, building houses, paying for medical care. This generosity earned him a nickname El Patron, the boss, and for many in Medellín, it was a title spoken with affection. In a country where the government often failed to provide basic services, Pablo became the provider. He built entire housing projects, soccer fields, schools, and churches. He gave scholarships to children who would otherwise never have gone to school. In the poorest barrios, his face appeared on murals, painted like a saint. But behind the charm, the business kept growing, and so did the danger. The Medellín Cartel had become a global operation, and with global power came global attention. The DEA had made Pablo one of its top targets. The US government wanted him captured or killed. Colombian authorities were under intense pressure to cooperate, but Pablo's money reached into every corner of the system. Judges, police, politicians, many were on his payroll. There was a strange paradox to this period of Pablo's life. On one hand, he had everything he had ever dreamed of: money, power, respect, even a measure of adoration from the poor. On the other hand, paranoia was beginning to creep in. He knew that with each passing day, his enemies were growing stronger, his list of rivals longer. There were whispers of betrayal, rumors of police investigations, threats from competitors. At night, Pablo would sit in his grand house, surrounded by wealth beyond imagining, and still he could not sleep easily. Guards patrolled outside. Weapons were kept close at hand. Safe rooms and escape tunnels were constructed. The man who had once been a daring, smiling smuggler now carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and with it, the constant fear that it could all be taken away. Imagine the contrast. Outside the gates of Hacienda Napoles, children played soccer on fields Pablo had built, their laughter filling the air. Inside the gates, the man who had given them that field sat in a high-backed chair, his mind turning over lists of names, allies, enemies, informants. The more powerful he became, the more he had to protect what he had built, and protection meant violence. Still, these were the golden years of Pablo's reign, when his wealth and influence were at their peak. He was said to be the seventh richest man in the world according to Forbes magazine, with a fortune estimated at more than 30 billion. His image was larger than life, half gangster, half folk hero. People would line the streets to catch a glimpse of him, some to cheer, others to glare in silence. This was the moment when Pablo might have walked away. He could have taken his fortune, left the business, disappeared to a country with no extradition treaty. But that was not who he was. For Pablo Escobar, money was never enough. He wanted power, real, political power. He wanted to be untouchable, not just by the law but by history itself. And so, instead of retreating, he stepped forward, moving into the dangerous world of politics. It was a decision that would change everything. The empire that had made him rich would soon make him a target like never before. The government he once bribed would soon become his sworn enemy. And the streets that once adored him would one day run red with blood. For now, though, Pablo's world was still shining, still golden. The cash kept flowing, the planes kept flying, and the man who had grown up in poverty now held a fortune that could rival kings. The storm clouds were gathering, but the thunder had not yet sounded. Medellín, for the moment, still belonged to Pablo Escobar. The hills of Medellín were alive with the sound of construction. Where once there had been only mud, dust, and crumbling shacks, new houses were rising, solid brick homes with electricity, running water, and real doors that locked. For the poorest families of Medellín, these homes were miracles. And at the center of those miracles stood one man, Pablo Escobar. He called the project Medellín Sin Tugurios, Medellín without slums. Entire neighborhoods were built with cartel money, gifted to the poor with no strings attached. Families who had been living in cardboard shacks suddenly had keys to homes with tiled floors and secure roofs. Mothers wept with gratitude. Children ran through the streets shouting Pablo's name. In a country where the government had failed them for decades, here was a man who delivered not promises, but results. Imagine the scene, the hot Colombian sun beating down on a ribbon-cutting ceremony. A crowd gathers, music playing, people cheering. Pablo arrives, smiling, waving, his presence commanding but warm. He shakes hands, kisses babies, listens to the people's problems. To them, he is not a criminal, he is a savior. A man who has risen from the same dirt roads they walk every day and who has not forgotten where he came from. And it wasn't just houses. Pablo sponsored local soccer teams, built dozens of community fields, and handed out cash to young players who dreamed of becoming stars. He funded schools, hospitals, and churches. He paid for medical treatments for those who could not afford them. When a neighborhood flooded, Pablo sent trucks of food and clothing. When a family lost a child, he paid for the funeral. This generosity earned him loyalty, a loyalty deeper than fear. In the barrios of Medellín, Pablo was untouchable not because of his guns, but because of the love of the people. If the police came looking for him, neighbors would warn him before they even entered the area. If strangers asked questions, they were met with silence. Children became lookouts, men became guards, women became messengers. The community became his shield, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to protect the man who had given them a better life. There is a kind of quiet power in this image. Picture the hills at night, lit by hundreds of small lights from the houses Pablo had built. From a distance, the neighborhoods looked like constellations scattered across the mountainside, each one a testament to his influence. While politicians argued in Bogota and promised reforms that never came, Pablo acted. But this image, as beautiful as it might seem, carried a darker shadow. Pablo's generosity was not free of cost. Every soccer field, every brick house, every medical bill paid for came from cocaine shipments that were flooding the streets of Miami and New York. For every family that was lifted out of poverty in Medellín, countless others around the world were being torn apart by addiction, by crime, by violence fueled by the very product that made Pablo rich enough to give. Still, for the people who lived under his protection, the morality of it did not matter. What mattered was that their children could sleep in safe homes, that they had food on the table, that someone powerful finally cared whether they lived or died. Pablo became more than a man, he became a myth. His image spread far beyond Medellin. Journalists began to write about him, describing him as a Robin Hood figure. Some called him a modern-day outlaw hero, stealing from the rich, or in this case, the rich countries, and giving to the poor. This attention only fed Pablo's ego and his belief that he was destined for something greater than mere wealth. He began to imagine himself not just as a benefactor of the people but as their representative, their voice in a corrupt system that had ignored them. He spoke openly about politics, about reform, about justice. He criticized the government for neglecting the poor and claimed he could do better. And many believed him. There is something almost hypnotic about this stage of Pablo's life. It is the calm before the storm, the moment when everything still feels hopeful, when the violence has not yet consumed everything. To walk through a neighborhood Pablo built was to walk through living proof that change was possible, that power could serve the powerless. But under the surface, the machinery of the cartel kept turning. The shipments still left from jungle airstrips. The cash still flowed into warehouse. The bribes still passed into the hands of officials. And the enemies of Pablo Escobar were taking note. To the Colombian elite, Pablo's popularity was not inspiring, it was terrifying. A criminal was winning the hearts of the people, and if he chose to enter politics, he might just win there too. Late at night, Pablo would sit with his closest advisors, talking about the future. He spoke of running for office, of changing the laws, of ending extradition to the United States. He dreamed of a Colombia where he could live openly, where no one would call him a criminal, where he could be a respected man, perhaps even president one day. The thought was intoxicating and dangerous. For a man like Pablo, power was never enough until it was absolute. The Robin Hood image that made him beloved would also make him a threat to those in power. And when that threat became too great, they would not hesitate to strike back. But for now, the city still loved him. The streets of Medellin echoed with music, with soccer matches, with the laughter of children playing in fields Pablo had built. His legend was still shining bright. People prayed for him, thanked God for him, swore loyalty to him. And Pablo, smiling under the warm Medellin sun, believed he had found his place, not just as a rich man, but as a man of the people. What he could not yet see was that this love, as fierce as it was, would one day be tested by the fire of war. The government was watching, the Americans were waiting, and the balance between myth and reality was about to shatter. The Robin Hood of Medellin was about to step into politics, and the story of Pablo Escobar was about to take a turn that would shake Colombia to its core. The applause echoed through the halls as Pablo Escobar, dressed in a tailored suit, walked confidently into the chamber of Congress. For a man who had once stolen cars in the back streets of Medellin, it was a moment of triumph beyond imagining. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the members of Colombia's political elite turned to look at the new congressman who had risen from the barrios to stand among them. For Pablo, this was not just another business deal, this was history. It was 1982, and Pablo had been elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives. His victory was more than a seat in Congress, it was a statement. He had taken the money he made from the cocaine trade and turned it into political capital. He had campaigned on a platform of helping the poor, building housing, creating jobs. The people had believed in him because they had seen him act where the government had failed. Now, he was not just El Patron, he was a public official. Imagine the pride swelling in him as he sat down in that chamber for the first time. He had done it. He had taken the step from outlaw to statesman. For a brief moment, Pablo may have believed that his dream of respectability was within reach, that he could transform himself from the world's most notorious smuggler into a legitimate political power. But power, once gained, is rarely left uncontested. Pablo's entry into politics sent shockwaves through Colombia's establishment. To the country's elites, this was more than an election win, it was an invasion. A man they considered a criminal had infiltrated the very heart of government. They feared what might come next. Would he run for higher office? Would he try to change the laws to protect himself and his empire? Would he turn Colombia into his own kingdom? Pablo's opponents began to dig into his past, determined to expose him. And it did not take long for the first cracks to appear. The press began publishing articles linking him to the cocaine trade. Photographs surfaced, grainy but damning, of Pablo standing next to known smugglers and criminals. Opponents in Congress whispered about his fortune, about the bribes, about the violence that followed him like a shadow. The pressure grew. Journalists called him a narcotraficante, and for the first time, Pablo felt the sting of public humiliation. He was used to being loved, admired, feared but not mocked. And then came the moment that would mark the turning point of his political dream. Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla stood in front of Congress and openly denounced Pablo Escobar as a drug trafficker. He accused him of being one of the biggest criminals in Colombia, a man who had built his fortune on blood and cocaine. The words struck like a thunderclap. Cameras turned toward Pablo, the room fell silent, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. Imagine the heat rising in Pablo's face as the accusations rang through the chamber. He tried to deny them, of course, tried to claim that he was being persecuted because he had dared to help the poor. But the damage had been done. The dream of respectability, the hope of becoming a legitimate politician, was crumbling before his eyes. Outside Congress, the press swarmed him. Protesters shouted. The government stripped him of his congressional seat and his immunity. He was no longer a representative of the people, he was once again a wanted man. The humiliation cut deep, deeper than perhaps anything Pablo had ever experienced. This was not just a political loss, this was a personal insult, a public unmasking. And Pablo Escobar was not a man who took insults lightly. He withdrew from public life, but inside, something had hardened. The man who had once dreamed of becoming president now dreamed of revenge. If the government wanted a war, Pablo was ready to give them one. And so began the next chapter of his life, a chapter not of politics and diplomacy, but of terror and blood. There is a quiet dread in this moment, like the pause before a storm breaks. The applause of Congress had turned to condemnation, the smiles of the elite had turned to sneers. Pablo had reached for legitimacy and been pushed back into the shadows. But in those shadows, he was more dangerous than ever. At night, Medellín buzzed with tension. Pablo's men gathered in hidden houses, whispering, planning. Names were written down, lists made. Those who had humiliated him would not be allowed to sleep easy. In the distance, the city lights flickered like watchful eyes, unaware that soon they would be lit by the flash of bombs and the fire of gunshots. For now, though, the streets were still calm. The poor still loved him, still saw him as their Robin Hood, still believed he had been betrayed by the corrupt government. But Pablo's thoughts were turning darker, more violent. His dreams of building a better Colombia had been replaced by a single, burning thought to strike back at those who had dared to cross him. The fall from grace was complete. The man who had once sat proudly in Congress was now preparing to declare war on the state itself. And when that war came, it would plunge Colombia into one of the bloodiest chapters of its history. The streets of Bogota had grown tense. The air seemed thicker, as if the city itself could sense what was coming. The man who had once walked into Congress dreaming of legitimacy was now preparing for war, and when Pablo Escobar declared war, he did not whisper, he shouted with bullets and bombs. It began slowly, almost quietly, with the assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice who had exposed Pablo's ties to the cocaine trade. One night in April 1984, as Lara Bonilla was being driven through the streets, two gunmen on motorcycles pulled up alongside his car. Shots rang out. Glass shattered. Within moments, the minister was dead. The message was unmistakable: those who crossed Pablo Escobar would pay with their lives. The murder shocked Colombia. For the first time, the government realized that this was not just a criminal, this was a man willing to kill anyone, anywhere, no matter their position or power. The war had officially begun. Imagine the fear that gripped the country in those days. Judges, prosecutors, politicians, no one felt safe. Every morning, the newspapers brought fresh headlines: another assassination, another bomb, another threat. Pablo's cartel unleashed a campaign of terror designed to force the government to abandon its policy of extraditing drug traffickers to the United States. Extradition was Pablo's greatest fear. To him, being sent to an American prison was a fate worse than death. And so he coined a chilling phrase that would become his banner: "Preferimos una tumba en Colombia a una cárcel en Estados Unidos." We prefer a grave in Colombia to a jail cell in the United States. Soon, the campaign escalated. Car bombs exploded outside police stations, government buildings, even shopping centers. One by one, journalists who wrote against the cartel were silenced. Entire neighborhoods would shake with the force of the blasts. People would wake to the sound of sirens, to streets filled with smoke and rubble, to the cries of the wounded. Picture the night sky of Medellín glowing orange as another car bomb detonated, the windows of houses shattering for blocks around. The smell of gasoline and burning metal filled the air. Fear seeped into every corner of the city. Parents kept children indoors, businesses closed early, and every shadow seemed to hold danger. Pablo's strategy was simple but terrifying: make the country ungovernable until the government had no choice but to negotiate. The Medellín Cartel targeted anyone connected to the justice system. Judges were gunned down, police officers assassinated, politicians kidnapped. Airplanes were not spared either. In November 1989, Avianca Flight 203, a commercial airliner, exploded in midair after a bomb planted by cartel operatives detonated, killing all 107 people aboard. The intended target had been a presidential candidate who opposed the cartel, but he had not boarded the plane. The horror of that moment rippled across Colombia like a shockwave. Ordinary citizens, once sympathetic to Pablo for his generosity, now began to turn against him. The blood was too much, too public, too indiscriminate. Children, mothers, fathers, innocent lives were being lost in a war that seemed to have no rules. And yet, Pablo did not stop. To him, this was survival. This was a fight to the death. He knew that if he lost, he would end up behind bars in a foreign land, far from the city he loved, powerless. He could not allow that to happen. In the midst of the terror, Pablo also tried to play the role of negotiator. He sent messages to the government offering to surrender, but only if extradition was banned forever. He offered to pay Colombia's national debt in exchange for amnesty. The offers were bold, almost absurd, but they showed just how much leverage he believed he had. Meanwhile, Medellín became a city under siege. Cartel sicarios, young hitmen barely out of their teens, roamed the streets on motorcycles, carrying out executions in broad daylight. The murder rate soared until Medellín became the most dangerous city in the world. Funerals became daily events, and entire generations grew up with the sound of gunfire as a constant backdrop. Imagine the eerie quiet just before dawn, when the city seemed to hold its breath, and then the crack of gunfire shattering the silence. Families would rush to their windows, already knowing what they would find: another body in the street, another life claimed by the war. And yet, through all of this, Pablo maintained his image as a benefactor in the barrios. He still sent money for food, still paid for funerals of the poor, still built houses. To many, he was both savior and executioner, a paradox they struggled to reconcile. The Colombian government, under pressure from the United States, responded with increasing force. Special task forces were formed. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Raids were carried out on cartel safe houses. But each time the government struck, Pablo struck back harder. It became a cycle of blood and retaliation that seemed endless. This was a dark chapter not just in Pablo's life, but in Colombia's history. Entire communities were traumatized, living in fear that the next bomb, the next shooting, could strike them. And still, Pablo remained elusive, moving from one safe house to another, surrounded by loyal men, always one step ahead of the law. There is a haunting stillness in imagining him in those moments, sitting in a safe house, the windows blacked out, the air thick with cigarette smoke, listening to a radio report about the very bomb he had ordered hours earlier. He was no longer the smiling Robin Hood, he was a general waging war from the shadows, his empire now soaked in blood. But even in war, there are limits. Pablo's campaign of terror could not last forever. The more he attacked, the more determined his enemies became to bring him down. The government's resolve hardened, the United States sent more agents and resources, and new enemies, rival cartels, vigilant groups, began to rise. The walls were closing in, even if Pablo could not yet see them. For now, though, the bombs were still exploding, the assassins still riding, and Colombia still trembled under the weight of one man's battle against the state. The Robin Hood of Medellín had become the terrorist of Colombia, and the war he had unleashed was only just reaching its peak. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar's empire had outgrown Colombia. What had once been a local operation smuggling contraband was now a global machine, and its most profitable market lay to the north, the United States. Pablo understood that Miami was the gateway, the perfect port through which his white powder could flow like an endless river. And so, he turned his gaze outward, planning routes, buying planes, and tightening his grip on every link in the supply chain. Miami was already changing. Once a quiet city of retirees and beachgoers, it was becoming something else entirely, a playground of fast money, neon lights, and cocaine-fueled excess. The streets of Miami's Little Havana buzzed with new wealth, much of it unexplained. Nightclubs stayed open until dawn, the air heavy with perfume, cigar smoke, and the faint, unmistakable tang of cocaine. Dealers and smugglers flaunted gold chains, fast cars, and stacks of cash. It was the era that would come to be known as the reign of the cocaine cowboys. Imagine a quiet airstrip somewhere deep in the Colombian countryside. Under the cover of night, men loaded bricks of cocaine into a small twin-engine plane. Each brick was carefully wrapped and marked with a symbol, a scorpion, a crown, a star, so Pablo's men could track whose shipment it was. The plane lifted off into the humid night, skimming low over the jungle canopy to avoid radar, heading north toward the Caribbean. Hours later, the plane would touch down in the Bahamas or on a remote strip in South Florida. From there, the product moved quickly into the hands of distributors who would flood Miami, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond. The profits were staggering. A kilo of cocaine that cost just a few $1,000s to produce in Colombia could sell for $50,000 or more on the streets of Miami. Multiply that by hundreds of kilos per shipment, dozens of shipments per month, and you begin to understand the scale of the fortune Pablo was amassing. The money came back in suitcases, in hidden compartments, in duffel bags stuffed so full that they were difficult to carry. Miami banks became overwhelmed. So much cash was pouring in that some banks stopped asking questions and simply weighed the money instead of counting it. Drug money fueled construction booms, luxury car sales, even entire neighborhoods. And with the money came violence. Rival gangs fought over territory, drive-by shootings became common, and bodies began turning up in the streets. Picture a hot Miami afternoon in 1981, a black Monte Carlo rolls up outside a busy mall. Suddenly, gunfire erupts, a hail of bullets spraying the parking lot in broad daylight. Shoppers scream, duck for cover. When the smoke clears, several people are dead. The newspapers would later call it the Dadeland Mall Massacre, one of the first public warnings that Miami had become ground zero for the cocaine wars. The violence drew the attention of the U.S. government like never before. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, expanded its operations in Florida, working with local police to track shipments, arrest traffickers, and seize planes and boats. Radar coverage was increased, surveillance teams were put in place, and federal prosecutors began building cases against anyone connected to the Medellín Cartel. But Pablo was always one step ahead. His pilots changed routes constantly, his shipments were staggered to minimize losses, and his network of informants often warned him of raids before they happened. Even when shipments were intercepted, they were just a fraction of the whole. The cartel had grown so massive that losing one plane, even 1 ton of cocaine, barely made a dent. Still, the pressure was mounting. The DEA began targeting Pablo personally, naming him as the kingpin behind the flood of cocaine entering the United States. His name was added to international watch lists, and warrants were issued. Extradition treaties between Colombia and the U.S. became a central political issue. Meanwhile, back in Medellín, Pablo's wealth reached mythic proportions. The money flowing in from the U.S. funded more houses for the poor, more soccer fields, more bribes, more weapons. It was a cycle that seemed unstoppable. Cocaine turned into dollars, dollars turned into influence, influence turned into protection. But with each passing month, the stakes grew higher. The U.S. was no longer treating cocaine as a nuisance but as a national crisis. Newspapers ran stories about the epidemic of addiction, the violence in Miami, the children caught in the crossfire. Public opinion demanded action, and action was coming. Imagine Pablo in his Hacienda Napol's office, surrounded by ledgers, maps, and radio equipment. His men report on shipments, on rival cartels, on police movements. Outside, The sounds of his private zoo drift through the warm night, a hippo splashing in its pond, exotic birds calling from the trees. He lights a cigarette and leans back, listening, thinking. For now, he is untouchable. For now, the money is still coming. But somewhere deep inside, he must know that this expansion, this empire, cannot last forever. This was the height of Pablo's reach. From the hills of Medellín to the streets of Miami, his product flowed like an invisible river, shaping economies, corrupting governments, rewriting the criminal underworld. He had built an empire unlike any other, and the world had no choice but to notice. And notice they did. The next phase of Pablo's story would not just be about wealth or smuggling, it would be about survival. The war he had started in Colombia would soon be joined by another war, one waged by the full force of the U.S. government, determined to bring down the man they called the king of cocaine. The war Pablo Escobar had unleashed was far from one-sided. For years, he had dominated the cocaine trade, controlling the smuggling routes, the labs, and the lion's share of profits. But as his power grew, so did the number of enemies waiting for their chance to strike back. And now, those enemies were ready. In Cali, another cartel was rising, one very different from Pablo's Medellín organization. Where Pablo ruled with fire and fear, the Cali cartel preferred shadows and subtlety. Its leaders Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, Gema Pacho Herrera, and Jose Chepe Santa Cruz Londono were businessmen first, killers second. They bribed instead of bombed, negotiated instead of threatened. Their strategy was quieter, but no less dangerous. Imagine a dimly lit office in Cali, the Rodriguez brothers seated around a polished table, papers spread out before them. They were patient men, calculating and precise. They saw Pablo's open war with the government not as a threat to themselves, but as an opportunity. While Medellín burned under the weight of bombs and assassinations, Cali expanded its networks, building relationships with politicians, police, and businessmen. They were preparing for the day when Pablo would fall, and they would be ready to take his place. But Cali was not Pablo's only enemy. In the shadows, a new force was forming, a vigilant group calling itself Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. They were a mix of paramilitaries, rival traffickers, and even former associates of Pablo himself. Their goal was simple: destroy Pablo Escobar by any means necessary. Los Pepes unleashed their own wave of terror, but this time, it was aimed squarely at Pablo and anyone loyal to him. They hunted down his associates, burned his properties, killed his lawyers, bodyguards, and even distant relatives. They posted threatening signs in the streets, warning that anyone who helped Pablo would share his fate. The violence became personal. Families of cartel members were targeted. Safe houses that had once been sanctuaries turned into traps. One by one, Pablo's network began to crumble under the relentless pressure. There were whispers that Los Pepes were receiving help from Colombian security forces and perhaps even from the United States. It was rumored that intelligence gathered by government agencies was being passed to the vigilantes, allowing them to strike with chilling accuracy. Pablo must have felt the walls closing in. Imagine him pacing inside one of his hidden ranches late at night, the room lit only by a single bare bulb. Maps and photos are spread across the table, the faces of allies who have been killed, the names of those who might betray him next. The once confident kingpin now forced to question everyone around him. Medellín itself was changing. The people who had once loved Pablo, who had cheered when he built them houses, who had prayed for him, were beginning to turn away. The bombs had taken too many innocent lives, the blood had flowed for too long. Fear replaced loyalty. Where once children acted as lookouts for Pablo, now they stayed indoors when his men passed by. And yet, Pablo still fought back. He ordered retaliations against Los Pepes, against Cali, against anyone who dared to oppose him. The streets of Medellín became a battleground, bodies piling up on both sides. The Colombian government, meanwhile, intensified its pursuit. With U.S. backing, they formed a special police unit, the search block tasked exclusively with capturing or killing Pablo Escobar. These were elite forces, heavily armed, trained to hunt him down. They raided safe houses, seized weapons, arrested anyone suspected of helping him. Imagine the sound of helicopters thundering over the hills of Medellín, soldiers rappelling down into rural fincas, dogs barking, gunfire echoing in the night. Each raid brought them closer, each captured associate providing new information, each tip narrowing the circle around Pablo. The pressure was relentless. Even within the cartel, cracks were beginning to show. Some of Pablo's closest allies began to surrender to authorities or cut deals with Cali to save themselves. Loyalties that had once seemed unshakable now dissolved under the weight of fear. Through it all, Pablo remained defiant. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for long. He relied on his family for comfort, spending his rare quiet moments with his wife and children, reading letters from them, talking to them on smuggled phones. But even those moments were haunted by the knowledge that Los Pepes had targeted his loved ones too, that no one was truly safe. The war had shifted. No longer was Pablo the unstoppable force he once was, now he was the hunted, the man on the run, the king whose throne was crumbling beneath him. But like a cornered lion, he was at his most dangerous. Picture Medellín at dusk, the sky glowing red, the hills dotted with lights. Somewhere out there, Pablo is hiding, surrounded by loyal sicarios, his mind racing with plans for escape, revenge, survival. The sound of distant gunfire is just another reminder that the net is tightening, that the days of ruling like a king are coming to an end. For the people of Colombia, this was a time of uneasy hope. Perhaps the nightmare was ending, perhaps the violence would soon stop. But they also knew that Pablo Escobar would not go quietly. The man who had once taken on an entire nation was not going to surrender without a fight. The stage was set for the final act, a man hunted not just by the government, but by his rivals, his former allies, and his own ghosts. The king of Medellín was now a fugitive, his empire collapsing around him, yet still defiant, still dangerous, still refusing to bow. In 1991, Pablo Escobar made a decision that shocked the world. After years of running, hiding, and fighting a bloody war against the Colombian government, he agreed to surrender. But Pablo Escobar never surrendered on anyone else's terms, only his own. The deal he struck was extraordinary. In exchange for giving himself up, he would not be extradited to the United States. He would serve his sentence in Colombia, but in a prison of his own design. La Catedral, as it would come to be known, was unlike any prison the world had ever seen. Perched high in the mountains overlooking Medellín, it was less a jail and more a fortress, a private kingdom disguised as punishment. Imagine driving up a winding mountain road through mist and pine forests. At the top, behind tall gates and high walls, sits La Catedral. The view is breathtaking. Medellin sprawled out below like a sea of lights at night. Guards patrol the perimeter, but they are Pablo's guards, loyal to him, not the government. Inside, there are no cold cells or barred windows. Instead, there are large rooms with comfortable beds, a billiards table, a stocked bar, a jacuzzi, even a waterfall. There is a soccer field where Pablo would play matches with his men, laughing, kicking up dust under the mountain sun. To the outside world, Pablo was imprisoned. To those who visited, it was clear La Catedral was a sanctuary, a place where Pablo could live safely, run his empire, and entertain guests, all while technically serving time. Inside those walls, business did not stop. Pablo continued to run the Medellín Cartel as if nothing had changed. Phones rang day and night, carrying orders to his lieutenants. Deals were struck, shipments planned, money counted. La Catedral became the beating heart of the cartel, protected by the very deal Pablo had made with the state. But Pablo's version of justice also continued within those walls. When two of his trusted lieutenants were accused of stealing millions, Pablo had them brought to La Catedral. There, in what was supposed to be a prison, they were tortured and killed. The news of the murders leaked, and suddenly, the illusion of Pablo's surrender began to shatter. The Colombian government, already embarrassed by the arrangement, realized they had effectively given Pablo a safe haven. Under pressure from the United States, they made a decision: Pablo would be moved to a real prison, one where he could no longer control his empire so freely. But Pablo Escobar was not a man who allowed himself to be moved like a pawn on someone else's board. The night the authorities came to transfer him, La Catedral was quiet. The mountain mist rolled in, the lights of Medellin twinkled far below. Inside, Pablo had been warned. He knew what was coming. His men were ready. When government officials arrived at the gates, they were stopped at gunpoint and turned away. Pablo was not going anywhere. And then, like a phantom, he vanished. Using tunnels and secret routes, he escaped into the mountains before the army could storm the prison. By morning, La Catedral was empty, its walls echoing with silence. The man who had surrendered was once again free, and once again at war with the state. Imagine the tension in Medellin after that night. The people woke to the news that Pablo Escobar had escaped from the very prison he had built. Soldiers flooded the hills, helicopters circled overhead, checkpoints were set up across the city. But Pablo was already gone, slipping through the countryside, moving from safe house to safe house, surrounded by his most loyal men. La Catedral stood as a symbol of both his audacity and his defiance. It was the place where the government had thought they had caged the lion, only to find that the lion still ruled the mountain. For Pablo, the escape marked the beginning of the final chapter of his story. The deal that had once protected him was gone. The government was no longer willing to negotiate. The United States increased its involvement, sending more agents, more intelligence, more money to help track him down. And Los Pepes, the vigilantes who had sworn to destroy him, saw their chance and struck harder than ever. But for a moment, imagine Pablo standing on a ridge just beyond La Catedral the night he escaped. The cold mountain air stinging his face, the city lights flickering far below, his breath slow and steady. He was free again, yes, but more hunted than ever. He had outplayed the government once more, but this time there would be no deals, no negotiations. The game had turned into a fight to the death. The days of soccer matches and billiards inside his private fortress were over. Ahead lay a life of constant flight, of sleeping in one house one night and another the next, of relying only on those few he trusted completely. The fortress had become a memory, and the jungle, the city streets, and the safe houses of Medellin would now become his prison without walls. La Cathedral still stands today, a relic of one of the most surreal episodes in criminal history. Tourists sometimes visit, walking the same paths Pablo once walked, looking out over the same breathtaking view. It is quite there now, but if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear the echoes, the laughter of Pablo's soccer games, the murmur of his phone calls, the low hum of a man who believed he had beaten the entire system. But that illusion had ended the night he escaped. From this point forward, Pablo Escobar was not just a criminal or a fugitive, he was the most wanted man in the world, hunted by his enemies, by his rivals, and by his own past. The mountains were still wet with mist when Pablo Escobar disappeared into them, leaving La Cathedral behind like a ghost town. His escape had humiliated the Colombian government and shocked the world. They had thought him cornered, caged, controlled, but now he was free again, and his freedom felt like the opening of a new, darker chapter. The hunt began immediately. Soldiers and search block units swept through the hills, combing every road, every trail, every farmhouse. Helicopters thundered overhead. Checkpoints were thrown up across Medellin. Radios crackled with urgent orders, find him before he vanishes completely. But Pablo had prepared for this moment. Long before his surrender, he had built a network of safe houses throughout the city and the countryside, each stocked with food, weapons, and cash. He melted into that network like water into sand. Picture him in one of those safe houses, a small, nondescript house in a quiet Medellin neighborhood. The curtains are always drawn, the lights kept low. The air is heavy with cigarette smoke. Phones are constantly ringing as Pablo speaks in low tones to his remaining lieutenants, issuing orders, shifting resources, deciding who still has his loyalty and who no longer can be trusted. His wife and children stay close to him now, moving with him from place to place, living in the shadows. This was not the life of a king anymore. This was the life of a fugitive. Pablo could no longer enjoy the sprawling lawns of Hacienda Naples or the comfort of La Cathedral. Instead, he slept on thin mattresses in cramped rooms, his ears tuned to every noise outside. Each night, he wondered if the next knock on the door would be his last. The walls were closing in. Los Pepes intensified their campaign, killing anyone remotely connected to Pablo's operation. His lawyers, accountants, even distant cousins were gunned down. Safe houses were burned, vehicles ambushed, money seized. With every attack, Pablo's circle grew smaller, his resources thinner. And yet, he fought back with the same ferocity that had made him so feared. Sicarios loyal to him carried out revenge killings, leaving bodies in the streets as messages. Car bombs were detonated against those who dared to help Los Pepes. Medellin was gripped by a grim rhythm of attack and counterattack day after day. Imagine the tension that hung over the city like a fog. People whispered in marketplaces, in churches, on buses, where was Pablo? Would there be another bomb? Would Los Pepes strike again tonight? The sound of motorcycles in the distance made hearts skip a beat. Everyone knew that sicarios rode motorcycles. Every day brought news of another killing, another funeral, another name added to the list of the dead. But beneath the violence, something else was happening. Pablo was changing. The man who had once been bold enough to walk into Congress, who had once smiled at soccer games with children in the barrios, was now gaunt, paranoid, and haunted. He trusted fewer and fewer people. Even within his closest circle, suspicion ran high. If someone arrived late, he wondered if they had been followed. If a phone line clicked, he feared it was being tapped. Sometimes, in the rare quiet of the night, he would sit with his young son and talk about the future, a future that seemed increasingly out of reach. He still dreamed of a negotiated surrender, still believed that perhaps he could strike a deal with the government to end the war. But as the days passed, the possibility grew dimmer. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many enemies wanted him dead. Outside Medellín, the countryside offered no safety either. The army scoured the rural areas, raiding farms and ranches. Planes flew overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. The search block received more intelligence than ever before, some of it from informants who had once been loyal to Pablo but had now switched sides, hoping to save themselves or their families. Picture a cold, rainy night in the hills. Pablo, wrapped in a dark poncho, moves silently with a small group of men, slipping through the mud, their breath visible in the frigid air. Somewhere in the distance, they can hear helicopters, the thrum of rotor blades growing louder, then fading again. They keep walking, through streams, through fields, through the dark, always moving, always one step ahead. The weight of constant flight was taking its toll. Every time he changed safe houses, Pablo left behind pieces of his old life, catches of money, weapons, even friends who could no longer keep up. His empire, once vast and untouchable, was shrinking to a handful of loyal men and a few trusted hideouts. And yet, he was still Pablo Escobar. He still had enough money, enough power, enough cunning to remain out of reach. The search block raided safe house after safe house, sometimes missing him by minutes. Each escape added to his legend, the ghost of Medellín, always just out of grasp, taunting his pursuers. But legends cannot run forever. The net was drawing tighter with each passing week. The DEA provided advanced surveillance equipment, helping Colombian forces triangulate his calls. Los Pepes continued to erode his support network, one assassination at a time. Even the barrios, once his greatest shield, were no longer as safe. Too many civilians had died in the crossfire. Too many families were tired of living in fear. There is a strange, haunting calm in imagining these final months. The man who had once been the richest and most feared criminal in the world now lived like a shadow, his footsteps muffled, his voice lowered, his future shrinking to a narrow tunnel. The roar of his empire had faded to a whisper, but it was a whisper that still made Colombia tremble. Every Sunrise felt like a victory, one more day alive, one more day free. But with each Sunrise came the knowledge that the day of reckoning was coming. Somewhere out there, the search block was planning, listening, waiting. Somewhere out there, Los Pepes were sharpening their knives. And so, Pablo Escobar continued to run, to hide, to fight when he had to disappear when he could. Medellín, once his city, had become his hunting ground and his prison all at once. The stage was now set for the final chase, a man and a nation locked in a deadly game that could only end one way. Soon, the hunt would lead to the rooftops of a quiet neighborhood, and the story of Pablo Escobar would reach its inevitable, tragic climax. By late 1993, the hunt for Pablo Escobar had become the most intense manhunt in the world. The search block, the elite Colombian police unit created to capture him, was now fully focused, reinforced with intelligence, technology, and funding from the United States. What had once seemed like chasing a ghost was becoming a slow but certain tightening of a noose. Pablo had spent months moving between safe houses, constantly on the run, but the net was closing. The DEA had introduced advanced radio triangulation technology, devices that could trace calls within minutes. Every time Pablo picked up a phone, the signal brought his hunters one step closer. Imagine a dark room inside a search block command center, maps of Medellín spread across the walls, pins marking every suspected safe house. Officers lean over radios, headphones pressed to their ears, waiting for the next call to come through. Somewhere out there, Pablo is speaking to his family, to his men, to his dwindling network, and every word is a clue. But it wasn't just technology that brought the manhunt closer. Betrayals from within Pablo's own circle began to surface. Men who had once sworn loyalty to him were now turning informants, some out of fear, others out of a desire for revenge, and some simply to save their own lives. Los Pepes had played their part well, dismantling Pablo's empire piece by piece, leaving him isolated, weakened, and increasingly desperate. Each raid came closer than the last. One night, search block commandos stormed a house where Pablo had been just hours earlier. They found half-eaten food on the table, a still-warm cigarette in the ashtray, clothes left behind in a rush. The frustration among his pursuers was matched only by their determination. They knew they were closer than ever before. Meanwhile, Pablo's world had shrunk to just a handful of loyal bodyguards and his family, who were under constant surveillance themselves. He rarely stayed in one house for more than a night or two. He had grown thinner, more cautious. The once flamboyant kingpin now moved silently, slipping through back alleys, using decoys to throw off pursuers, even disguising himself to blend in with ordinary people. Picture Medellín during these weeks, the hills buzzing with activity, soldiers on patrol, checkpoints on every road. Helicopters circle overhead like restless birds of prey. Rumors spread quickly. Someone saw Pablo here, someone heard gunfire there, someone swore they saw him at a bakery that morning. The city was alive with tension, as if everyone knew the end was near. And Pablo must have known it too. Despite his caution, he could not resist calling his family, especially his son. Those calls became his undoing. Each time he reached out, the DEA and search block grew better at narrowing down his location. They learned to trace him faster, closing the window between the call and the raid from hours to minutes. One of those calls would prove to be the turning point. On 2nd December 1993, Pablo called his son for the second time that day, speaking for several minutes. The triangulation teams sprang into action. Radios crackled. Coordinates were calculated. Commanders gave the order, move in. Imagine the adrenaline surging through the search block unit as they raced through the streets of Medellín, sirens silent, guns loaded. Their destination was a modest two-story house in the middle-class neighborhood of Los Olivos. Inside, Pablo and his last loyal men were unaware that their location had been pinpointed. The house itself was ordinary, white walls, a red-tiled roof, narrow windows. Nothing about it suggested that the most wanted man in the world was inside. But the streets outside soon filled with armored vehicles and soldiers taking up positions. Snipers climbed to nearby rooftops. The trap was ready to spring. Inside the house, Pablo may have sensed something. Perhaps it was a sound, the crunch of boots outside, the faint bark of a dog disturbed by the soldiers, the stillness in the air that comes just before violence erupts. He grabbed his gun. His men did the same. The search block moved in. They stormed the house, shouting, kicking down the door. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the small space. Pablo and his men fired back, bullets tearing through plaster and glass. Smoke filled the rooms, the smell of gunpowder choking the air. Pablo fled to the rooftop, scrambling up a set of stairs, his pistol in one hand, his breath ragged. Bullets cracked overhead as soldiers followed him. On the roof, he returned fire, but he was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Imagine the scene from a distance, the rooftops of Los Olivos glowing under the afternoon sun, the crackle of gunfire echoing off the walls, neighbors speaking from windows, children crying as their parents pulled them away. The man who had ruled Medellín for a decade was now cornered on a rooftop, his empire reduced to a single desperate fight for survival. Moments later, it was over. Pablo Escobar lay dead, his body sprawled on the red tiles, blood pooling beneath him. Whether he was killed by a police bullet or chose to take his own life, as some have suggested, remains one of the enduring questions of his story. What is certain is that the most feared man in Colombia was no longer running. The hunt had ended. But for now, in our narrative, we pause here at the very edge of the climax. The manhunt had reached its zenith, the circle had closed, and the world was about to learn that Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, was no more. The afternoon sun hung low over Medellín, casting long shadows across the narrow streets of Los Olivos. The neighborhood, usually filled with the sound of children playing and neighbors talking over fences, had fallen eerily quiet. Doors were shut, curtains drawn, as the echo of gunfire faded into a tense stillness. Soldiers moved cautiously through the house, weapons raised, boots crunching on broken glass. Somewhere above them, Pablo Escobar was running out of time. He burst onto the rooftop, his breath ragged, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool air. The red tiles were hot under the sun, the view stretching out toward the mountains he had ruled for so long. From this height, Medellín looked peaceful, the same city that had once adored him, the same city he had turned into a battlefield. For a brief moment, he might have felt the weight of it all, the rise, the riches, the war, the countless lives touched by his choices. Gunfire cracked again, sharp and close. Pablo crouched, returning fire with a pistol clutched tightly in his hand. Bullets chipped the tiles around him, fragments flying into the air. The sound was deafening, echoing across the rooftops. But there was no escape. Soldiers had surrounded the building, snipers watching from nearby houses. The circle was complete. Imagine the stillness between bursts of gunfire, the kind of stillness where every sound seems louder, the flap of a curtain in the wind, the buzz of a distant motorcycle, the pounding of Pablo's own heartbeat. For years, he had been the hunter, the man who made others afraid to sleep at night. Now, he was the one being hunted, the one with nowhere left to run. He tried to move, perhaps to leap to the next roof, perhaps just to find one last bit of cover, but the gunfire followed him. He was hit once, then again. He staggered, his legs giving way, and fell hard against the tiles. The pistol slipped from his hand. His breathing slowed. Some accounts say that Pablo's final shot was fired by the search block, a clean rifle shot that ended the most intense manhunt in Colombia's history. Others believe he took his own life, placing the barrel of his pistol to his head rather than allow himself to be captured. We may never know for certain. What we do know is that when the gunfire stopped, Pablo Escobar lay still, the afternoon sun warm on his face, the red tiles beneath him stained dark. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, soldiers began to climb onto the roof, their boots clattering on the tiles. They approached cautiously, weapons still raised, until it became clear that the fight was over. The man who had once been untouchable, who had defied governments and terrorized a nation, was gone. News spread quickly. Radios crackled with reports, televisions across Colombia cut into regular programming. People in Medellin stepped out of their houses, gathering in small groups to whisper, to pray, to cry, to celebrate. Some wept openly, mourning the man they still saw as a Robin Hood. Others cheered, relieved that the nightmare of bombings and assassinations might finally be over. Imagine standing in that neighborhood as word spread. The rooftops were still warm from the gunfight, the streets littered with shell casings. Children peered from doorways, their mothers pulling them back gently, not wanting them to see too much. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air like a ghost. For Pablo's family, it was a devastating moment. His mother, Hermilda, would later claim that her son had been executed, not killed in battle. His widow and children, now more vulnerable than ever, would soon flee Colombia, seeking refuge abroad. The man they had loved, despite everything, had met his end not in a palace, not in a mansion, but on a modest rooftop in a quiet neighborhood. And for Pablo himself, if there was time for him to think, for him to know what was coming, perhaps there was a flash of recognition, of understanding that this was always how it would end. That a life built on defiance, on violence, on daring fate could only have one conclusion. As the soldiers posed for photographs next to the body, images that would soon circle the globe, the sun began to dip lower, casting a soft golden light over the scene. It was strangely quiet, almost peaceful. The war that had raged for so many years seemed to pause, as if the city itself was taking a breath. In that moment, Medellin belonged not to Pablo Escobar, not to the cartel, not to the search block, but to silence. The man who had once ruled with fear had been reduced to just another figure on a rooftop, another body in the story of Colombia's long struggle for peace. The morning after Pablo Escobar's death, Medellin woke up to a city forever changed. The streets that had echoed with gunfire the day before were quiet now, washed clean by an overnight rain. The air felt different, lighter to some, heavier to others. News had spread like wildfire, El Patron was dead. For many, it was a moment of relief. The nightmare of bombings, assassinations, and car explosions seemed, at last, to be over. People ventured outside cautiously, as if testing whether the danger had truly passed. Shopkeepers opened their shutters a little earlier, children dared to play in the streets again, and neighbors whispered about what might come next. The fear that had gripped Medellin for so long began to loosen its hold. But not everyone felt relief. In the poorest barrios, where Pablo had built houses, schools, and soccer fields, the news struck like a personal tragedy. Mothers who had been given keys to new homes wept openly. Old men gathered on street corners, shaking their heads in disbelief. Children lit candles outside their doors. For them, Pablo was not a drug lord or a terrorist, he was the man who had put food on their tables when no one else cared. The funeral became one of the largest gatherings Medellin had ever seen. Thousands poured into the streets, lining up for hours to pay their respects. The crowd swelled so large that police struggled to control it. Some mourners climbed walls and fences just to catch a glimpse of the coffin as it passed. Imagine the scene, The hot Colombian sun beating down on a sea of people, their voices low, the air heavy with grief. Some carried flowers, others clutched photographs of Pablo. Many sobbed openly, while others sang songs, their voices cracking with emotion. The narrow streets of Medellín overflowed with mourners, their bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with tears. Pablo's body was laid to rest at Jardines Montesacro Cemetery. The procession wound through the city like a river, carrying with it not just a coffin but an entire era of Colombian history. Journalists from around the world captured the moment, their cameras flashing as mourners reached out to touch the coffin, some whispering prayers, others kissing it. But not everyone mourned. For the families of the thousands who had died during Pablo's reign, the judges, the journalists, the police officers, the ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire, his death felt like justice. For them, this was not a tragedy, but the closing of a terrible chapter. The newspapers reflected this division. Some ran headlines declaring the end of an era of terror, others printed photographs of grieving crowds with captions that spoke of the death of a hero. The debate over who Pablo Escobar really was, savior or monster, had begun before his body was even in the ground. In the days that followed, Medellín remained in a strange, almost dreamlike state. There was no more gunfire, no more bombings, no more sudden assassinations. The city felt as though it were exhaling after years of holding its breath. And yet, there was also a sense of emptiness, as if a great presence had vanished. Love him or hate him, Pablo Escobar had shaped Medellín. Without him, the city seemed to be searching for its identity again. Picture the hills of Medellín at night in those days, candles flickering in windows, families gathering to talk about what had happened. Some told stories of how Pablo had helped them, how he had given them medicine, paid for their children's schooling, saved them from eviction. Others spoke of friends and relatives killed by his bombs, of the fear that had kept them awake at night. The government moved quickly to dismantle what remained of the Medellín Cartel, capturing or killing its remaining members. Rival groups, including the Cali Cartel, rushed to fill the vacuum. The violence did not end overnight. In fact, in some ways, it continued as new players fought for control, but the symbolic weight of Pablo's death could not be ignored. For Colombia as a nation, Pablo Escobar became a cautionary tale. Schools taught children about the dangers of the drug trade, the cost of violence, the importance of justice. Politicians used his name as a reminder of what happens when corruption and crime are allowed to flourish. And yet, in the years that followed, something curious happened. Pablo's image began to transform again, from feared criminal to cultural icon. His face appeared on murals, t-shirts, even souvenirs sold to tourists. Some celebrated him as a Robin Hood, others as a symbol of defiance against an unjust system. His story became legend, a story told over and over, sometimes romanticized, sometimes condemned. Imagine walking through Medellín today, standing at his grave in Jardines Montesacro. Visitors come from all over the world, leaving flowers, notes, even small gifts. Some come out of curiosity, some out of admiration, some simply to pay respects to a man who left an undeniable mark on history. For those who lived through his reign, the feelings remain complicated. To some, he will always be the boy from Rio Negro who became the richest man in Colombia, who built homes for the poor and gave them hope. To others, he will forever be the man who turned their city into a war zone, who filled the streets with fear and blood. But perhaps that is Pablo's true legacy, not a simple story of good or evil, but a reminder of the complexity of power, of ambition, of what happens when one man's dream grows so large that it consumes everything in its path. As night falls over Medellin, the city glows softly, its hillsides lit like constellations. Somewhere, a radio plays an old song, and an old man tells his grandson about the days when Pablo Escobar ruled these streets. The child listens wide-eyed, not sure whether to fear the man in the story or admire him. And so, the legend lives on, half hero, half villain, impossible to forget. The death of Pablo Escobar did not just end a man's life, it ended an era. Medellin, a city that had lived for years under his shadow, woke to a new reality. The man who had been both protector and destroyer, who had built homes and planted bombs, was gone. His body lay in the cemetery, but his empire, though wounded, still breathed in fragments. The Medellín Cartel had not vanished overnight, but without its leader, it was no longer the same unstoppable force. In the weeks following his death, the Colombian government moved quickly to dismantle what was left. Raids were carried out daily, sweeping through Medellin's hillsides, targeting safe houses, stash houses, and laboratories. One by one, Pablo's remaining lieutenants were captured or killed. The sicarios who had once roamed the streets fearlessly now fled, hiding or surrendering to authorities. Those who had been loyal only out of fear found little reason to fight without their patron. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of search block commanders as they ticked off names from their most wanted lists, the circle of Pablo's power shrinking until there was almost nothing left. For the first time in years, Medellin's murder rate began to drop. The city could breathe again, even if cautiously. But the cocaine trade did not disappear with Pablo. Power, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the Cali cartel. Unlike Medellin, Cali preferred subtlety. Its leaders did not bomb airplanes or assassinate presidential candidates. They worked quietly, bribing officials, laundering money through legitimate businesses, expanding their reach without drawing the same level of public outrage. Picture a sleek office building in Cali, far removed from the dusty hills of Medellin. Behind its tinted glass windows, well-dressed men sat in air-conditioned rooms, negotiating deals, signing contracts, expanding their empire with the precision of businessmen. To the outside world, they seemed almost respectable. To law enforcement, they were simply a different face of the same problem. The rise of Cali brought its own challenges. While the violence was less dramatic, the corruption ran deeper. Entire institutions were compromised, police, judges, even parts of the military. It was a quieter war, fought not with car bombs but with bribes and influence. Some in Colombia began to wonder if they had simply traded one kind of nightmare for another. And yet, there was progress. For Medellin, the end of the cartel's reign meant the beginning of a slow and painful recovery. The city that had once been called the most dangerous in the world began to invest in rebuilding itself. New schools were opened, libraries were built, public transportation systems were improved. The government poured resources into social programs, determined to give young people alternatives to the life of the sicario. Imagine the transformation. The same hills that had once echoed with gunfire now rang with the sound of children playing soccer. Murals appeared on the walls, not just of Pablo but of peace, of hope, of a better future. Tourists began to trickle back, curious to see the city that had been infamous around the globe. But the scars were deep. Families who had lost loved ones still grieved. Entire generations had grown up surrounded by violence, And the trauma lingered in quiet ways, in the way mothers flinched at loud noises, in the way young men carried themselves with the wary eyes of those who had seen too much too soon. In Bogota, politicians debated how to prevent another Escobar from rising. Anti-corruption campaigns were launched, judicial reforms pushed through. The extradition treaty with the United States, once so fiercely resisted by Pablo, became a key tool in dismantling the remaining drug networks. One by one, leaders of the Cali cartel were captured and extradited, their empire slowly dismantled just as Medellin's had been. Still, the memory of Pablo lingered. In the barrios, his name was spoken in hushed tones, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a complicated mix of both. Some families kept photographs of him on their walls, next to pictures of saints. Others refused to speak his name at all, as if keeping silent could keep the past from returning. There was also a kind of cultural reckoning. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to tell the story of the Narco years, trying to make sense of what had happened. Books were written, movies made, each one portraying a slightly different version of Pablo, the ruthless killer, the clever businessman, the tragic figure consumed by his own ambition. For Colombia, it was important to face this history, to acknowledge both the pain and the lessons it carried. The story of Pablo Escobar had become a mirror, reflecting not just one man's rise and fall but the weaknesses of a nation that had allowed him to grow so powerful. Picture a quiet Medellin evening years later. The hillsides are lit up, glowing softly like a necklace of stars. Somewhere, an old man sits on his porch, remembering the 1980s, the fear, the explosions, the funerals. He shakes his head slowly, telling his grandson how different things are now. How the buses run safely, how the police can patrol without being ambushed, how the city feels alive again. But even as Medellin rebuilt, there was always the sense that Pablo's ghost still walked its streets. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of how far the city had fallen and how far it had come. His story was now part of Medellin's story, inseparable from its identity. In the end, the Medellín Cartel was gone, but Colombia had been changed forever. It had paid a terrible price to defeat one man and his empire. The years of blood and terror had left wounds that would take decades to heal. And yet, there was hope that the future could be brighter, that the next generation might grow up without hearing the sound of bombs in the night. In the years after Pablo Escobar's death, something unexpected happened. The man who had once terrorized a nation slowly began to transform, not in reality, but in memory. His image, once feared, began to shift into legend. His story became the subject of books, documentaries, TV shows, and films. Across the world, people who had never even heard of Medellin now spoke Pablo Escobar's name with a kind of fascinated reverence. At first, the media coverage was grim, focused on the terror of the cartel years, the assassinations, the bombings, the rivers that had run red with blood. But soon, storytellers began to dig deeper. They looked beyond the violence, exploring the contradictions that made Pablo such a compelling figure, the man who killed without hesitation but also built homes for the poor, who was both a devoted family man and a ruthless kingpin, who sought respectability even as he burned down the very system he wanted to join. Imagine a writer sitting at a desk late into the night, surrounded by stacks of newspaper clippings, police files, and old photographs. They are piecing together Pablo's life like a puzzle, trying to understand what drove him: ambition, greed, love for his family, hatred of the elite, or perhaps all of these things at once. The story that emerges is not just about crime, but about power, about human nature, about the dangerous seduction of unchecked ambition. And then came the wave of dramatizations that would turn Pablo Escobar from a historical figure into a global icon. Television shows like Narcos brought his story to audiences in dozens of countries. On screen, Pablo was portrayed as charismatic, brilliant, and terrifying, a man capable of great love and great cruelty. Viewers were drawn in, captivated by the slow rise and dramatic fall, by the tension between the man and the myth. For many who watched, Pablo became a symbol not necessarily of heroism, but of defiance, of a man who refused to bow to any authority, who dared to take on an entire nation. Social media soon filled with images of him, with quotes attributed to him, some real, some invented, turned into slogans and memes. His face appeared on t-shirts, murals, even coffee mugs. This romanticizing of Pablo Escobar has always been controversial. To those who lost loved ones in his war, the idea of him as a folk hero feels like a wound reopened. For them, he was not a symbol but a murderer, the man who turned their neighborhoods into battlefields. And yet, the fascination persists, perhaps because his story contains something that resonates universally, the rise of a man from nothing to everything, and the inevitable fall that follows. Picture tourists arriving in Medellín today, many of them curious about Pablo's life. They take narco tours, visiting the site of Hacienda Napoles, the grave where he is buried, even the rooftop where he was killed. Guides tell the stories with a careful balance, part history lesson, part cautionary tale, part ghost story. Some visitors leave with admiration, others with sadness, some with a deeper understanding of Colombia's pain. For the people of Medellín, this global fascination is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has brought tourism, jobs, and a chance to rewrite the city's story. On the other, it has sometimes overshadowed the progress Medellín has made, trapping the city in the shadow of its most infamous son. There is also the question of truth. Every book, every film, every series about Pablo chooses which parts of his story to tell and which to leave out. Some emphasize his generosity, others his brutality. Some portray him as a tragic figure, others as a monster. In the end, Pablo Escobar exists as much in legend as in fact, a figure who can be shaped to fit whatever story the world wants to tell about him. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, watching grainy footage of Pablo smiling at a soccer match, waving to children, his face relaxed, almost gentle. Then imagine reading about the bombs that killed hundreds, the assassinations that shook a nation. Both are true. Both are part of the same man. Perhaps this is why his story continues to fascinate, because it forces us to confront contradictions we see in ourselves. How ambition can inspire and destroy. How love for one's family can coexist with violence against strangers. How a man can be both generous and ruthless, both human and monstrous. Today, Pablo Escobar's name lives on as a symbol of power, of danger, of possibility. For some, he represents what happens when the system fails its people, when poverty and corruption leave them with no choice but to follow a man who promises change, no matter the cost. For others, he is a warning of what happens when one man's dream grows so big that it swallows a country whole. As Medellín continues to evolve, it carries Pablo's story with it not as a burden, but as a reminder. The city has rebuilt, reimagined itself, turned its pain into art, its history into lessons. And yet, on certain nights, when the hills are quiet and the city lights flicker like stars, you can almost imagine him still there, somewhere, watching over the city he loved and feared, a ghost lingering on the rooftops. When the dust settled and the echoes of gunfire faded from Medellin's hills, what remained was not just the memory of one man's life, but a question that still lingers. What was the true cost of Pablo Escobar's empire? For years, he had dreamed of power, not just wealth, but the kind of power that could shape a nation. And for a time, he achieved it. He was feared by presidents, hunted by armies, and worshipped by the poor. But every dream has a price, and Pablo's price was written in blood. Imagine sitting in the quiet of an empty room late at night, reflecting on everything that has happened. Pablo's story plays like a slow, haunting symphony, the opening notes full of ambition and promise, the middle movement loud and chaotic, the final chords quiet, mournful, inevitable. He rose from a dusty boy in Rio Negro to one of the richest men on earth, and then fell from the rooftop of a humble house, his body lying in the open sun. The cost was not just his life. It was the lives of thousands, police officers ambushed on their way home, journalists silenced for telling the truth, judges and ministers assassinated for daring to resist. It was the cost paid by ordinary Colombians who woke every day wondering if a bomb would go off near their bus stop, if their loved ones would come home that night. And then there was the cost paid by Pablo's own family. His wife, Maria Victoria, once lived in mansions, surrounded by luxury, but in the end she was forced to flee with their children, hunted, begging foreign governments for asylum. His son, Juan Pablo, grew up idolizing his father, only to spend his adult life grappling with the weight of his name, eventually changing it to escape the shadow. His daughter, Manuela, was just a little girl when her father would burn stacks of cash to keep her warm on cold nights. She has largely vanished from the public eye, perhaps choosing silence as her own form of survival. Pablo Escobar once said that all he wanted was to be remembered, to leave his mark on the world. And he has, but not in the way he might have imagined. He is remembered not as a statesman or a philanthropist, but as a man whose ambition went too far, whose dream of building an empire turned into a nightmare for an entire country. There is something deeply human about Pablo's story, something that keeps drawing us back to it. Perhaps it is because his life is a reflection of the extremes within us all, the desire to rise, to be seen, to leave something behind. He was a man who refused to accept the limits of his birth, who fought to rewrite his destiny with every ounce of willpower he had. And in doing so, he achieved everything he wanted, and lost everything that truly mattered. Picture him in his last moments on that rooftop, the city spread out before him. Perhaps he thought of his family, of the soccer fields he built, of the friends he had lost, of the choices he had made. Perhaps he realized, too late, that there was no way back, that the path he had chosen could only lead to this ending. The tragedy of Pablo Escobar is not just that he died, it is that his death was inevitable from the moment he chose to build an empire on violence. There was never going to be a peaceful retirement, never going to be a day when he could simply walk away. The same ambition that lifted him up was the ambition that destroyed him. And yet, his story continues to fascinate not because it is unique, but because it is universal. History is filled with men like Pablo, men who rose high and fell hard, who were loved and hated, who tried to bend the world to their will and were eventually crushed by it. His life is a reminder that power, when pursued without limits, becomes a cage as much as a crown. Medellin today is a city transformed. Its streets are safer, its neighborhoods rebuilt, its people moving forward. But Pablo's presence still lingers like a shadow at dusk, a reminder of where the city has been and how fragile peace can be. His story is told to children not to glorify him, but to teach them about the dangers of that path, about the cost of choosing violence over dialogue, greed over community. As night falls and the city lights flicker on the hillsides, there is a strange calm. The bombs no longer shake the earth, the gunfire no longer cracks through the silence. But if you listen closely, you can still feel the echo of those years, the fear, the ambition, the loss. It is a memory that Medellin carries like a scar, not to forget, but to remember how much was lost and how hard it was to rebuild. Perhaps that is Pablo Escobar's final lesson. That no matter how powerful we become, no matter how much we take, there is always a reckoning. Empires built on fear eventually crumble. Kings of the underworld eventually fall. And when they do, what remains is not the money, not the mansions, not the legends, but the question of whether it was worth it. Today, Medellin is a city reborn. The hillsides that once echoed with the crack of gunfire now ring with music, laughter, and the sound of children playing long into the evening. The neighborhoods that Pablo Escobar once used as his stronghold have been transformed with libraries, parks, and cable cars connecting the poorest barrios to the heart of the city. The same streets where sicarios once rode motorcycles now bustle with vendors selling fruit, buses filled with workers, and students heading to school. Imagine standing on one of the city's hills at dusk. The sun is setting, painting the sky in deep orange and pink, and below you, Medellin glows like a sea of stars. It is peaceful now, humming with life instead of fear. The air is filled with the smell of arepas cooking, with the distant beat of salsa music drifting through open windows. This is not the Medellin of the 1980s. This is a city that has fought to reclaim itself. But Pablo's presence lingers, like a shadow cast by the past. His grave at Jardines Montesacro still draws visitors, some curious, some reverent. His face still appears on murals, some painted with halos, others with devil's horns, a reflection of the divided memory he left behind. There are tours that take visitors to Hacienda Naples, now a family theme park with a water park and dinosaur sculptures, a surreal twist on what was once the private kingdom of the most feared man in the country. For Medellin, remembering Pablo is complicated. To forget him would be to erase a part of its history, but to celebrate him would risk glorifying the very violence the city worked so hard to escape. Instead, Medellin has chosen to teach his story, not as a legend to be admired, but as a lesson to be learned. Schools, museums, and community programs talk openly about the era of the cartels, about the suffering, the mistakes, and the resilience of the people who endured it. And there is resilience everywhere. The city has become a symbol of transformation, winning international awards for innovation, urban design, and social development. Once called the murder capital of the world, Medellin is now held up as an example of how a city can heal. The cable cars that glide above the hillsides are more than just transportation, they are symbols of connection, of bringing the marginalized barrios into the life of the city. Pablo's story, in this new Medellin, feels less like a current event and more like a ghost story told at night, one that still carries a chill but also a warning. Parents tell their children about him not to inspire fear, but to teach them about choices, about what happens when ambition is not balanced by morality. They teach them that power without compassion is dangerous, that wealth without justice can destroy more than it builds. Picture walking through Comuna 13, once one of the most violent neighborhoods in the city, now a place filled with colorful murals and street art. Many of those murals depict the pain of the past, but they also speak of hope, of forgiveness, of a future built on something better. Children run up and down the steep stairways, their laughter a reminder that Medellin's story did not end on a rooftop in Los Olivos, it continued, and it continues still. For the world beyond Colombia, Pablo Escobar's story remains a fascination. His name has become shorthand for power, for ambition, for the extremes of human will. But it is also a story that invites reflection. What does it mean to win everything you ever wanted, only to lose it all? What does it mean to be remembered as both a hero and a villain, sometimes by the very same people? Perhaps the true ending of Pablo Escobar's story is not his death, but Medellin's rebirth. His life was a storm that tore through the city, leaving scars, but also leaving behind the determination to rebuild stronger than before. The people of Medellín did not allow themselves to be defined forever by fear. They turned their pain into action, their grief into growth. As night deepens over Medellín, the city glows peacefully, its lights stretching far into the valley. Somewhere in the hills, a breeze rustles through the trees, carrying with it the distant memory of a man who once ruled this place. The memory is not entirely bitter, not entirely sweet, it is simply part of the city's soul now. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you think about the lessons hidden in this story, that ambition must be tempered by conscience, that the cost of power can be far greater than its rewards, that even in the darkest times, redemption and renewal are possible. Pablo Escobar's life was a warning, but Medellin's transformation is a promise that even the most haunted places can find peace again. So we leave Pablo here, in the city that made him, and that outlived him, under the stars that once shone on his childhood and on his final night. His story is finished, but Medellin's story goes on brighter, quieter, and filled with hope.